Thank you. Thank you all so very much for coming today. Thanks to Annette for that wonderful introduction and for inviting us to participate in this public forum today. Professors Anatsui, Ogedici, and I are honored to speak with you today. I'd like to thank Simone Witcha for all of her generosity and her amazing staff here at the Blanton Museum. It's just been a dream to have the exhibition here. They've all been extremely generous and kind. A special thanks to Arnett Carlazzi, Deputy Director for Art and Programs. Working with her on this exhibition has been, again, a joy, and it would not have been possible without her. It's due to her professionalism, kindness, and enthusiasm for El and his work that Anatsui, when I last wrote to you about Africa, is on view at the Blanton Museum of Art. Thanks also go to her amazing staff, without which we would not have this exhibition. I'd like to give a special thank you to Amy Chang, Manager of Public Programs, who organized this afternoon here today, James Swan, head installer, who gave the exhibition a sense of movement and joy that I had always envisioned. It's the first time I'm seeing it as it was absolutely meant to be seen, and he gave the objects room to breathe, and that is such a very important thing for me as a curator. I'd also like to thank Jason Mendiola, who organized Elle's trip from Nigeria. It can often be an arduous trek, but we've gotten him here with safe and sound thanks to Jason. So wherever you are, Jason, thank you for that as well. I could not imagine a better venue for Anatsui's work, and I hope when we go through the images today, you'll be inspired to go back through the galleries and experience the work in person, in the flesh. There's also two very other important people I'd like to thank, Professor Moyo Ogedici, who lectures here at the university, and El Anatsui. It is his lifetime of beautiful work that brings us all here today. So with that, please allow me to properly introduce our guests of honor. Moyo. Moyo Ogedici is director of the Center of the Arts of Africa and its Diasporas here at the University of Texas, Austin. He's an art historian, an artist, and a curator. He studied fine arts at the University of Ife before proceeding to the University of Benin, where he did an MFA in African art criticism, poetry, and painting. So he's an artist and a scholar. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he received his PhD in African arts and diaspora visual cultures, and he's apprenticed with several indigenous African artists working in both sacred and secular mediums, including mat weaving, textile designs, terracotta, shrine painting, and sculpture. After teaching for several years in Nigeria, Professor Ogedici relocated to the United States in 1992, and for 10 years, he was the curator of African and Oceanic arts at the Denver Art Museum. And I'd like to say that this is very much a homecoming for me because I first taught at the University of Colorado and worked at the Denver Art Museum for Professor Ogedici, and it is really due to his invitation and intervention that I have this relationship with Al and have the wonderful position I do at the Museum for African Art today. So thank you for that very generous intervention in my career. He's also exhibited, as I mentioned, he's an artist, at various places, including the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Corcoran Center in London, National Museum in Lagos, Nigeria. And he's the author of several books and exhibition catalogs, including African Renaissance, Old Forms, New Images in Nigerian Art, and The Shattered Gourd, Yoruba Forms in 20th Century American Art, which I believe we worked on a little bit together when I was in Denver, so I'm honored to have been a part of that. And now, Professor Anatsui. Anatsui was born in Ghana in 1944 and earned a bachelor's degree in sculpture and a postgraduate diploma in art education from the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. He's currently professor of sculpture at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, where I believe he very much hopes to retire at the end of this month. We'll see if they let him go. So he's been professor there since 1975, and in the intervening years, he's had work that appeared in group exhibitions at the Fowler Museum of Cultural History at UCLA, the October Gallery in London, the celebrated Africa Remix exhibition that toured to London, Paris, Tokyo, Stockholm, and Johannesburg, which was quite a coup. He's also participated in many biennales, including Venice, Havana, Johannesburg, Gwangju, Sharjah, and Prospect One in New Orleans. Gau, a solo show of his metal sculptures, which I hope you've seen in the galleries or will go see after this talk, has traveled through Europe, North America, and Asia. In 2008, he received the Visionaries Artist Award from the Museum of Art and Design in New York. He's a laureate of the 2009 Prince Claus Award, and his work has been collected by institutions internationally, including the British Museum London, where I first saw his work, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, the Denver Art Museum, thanks to Professor Ogadichi, the Nelson Atkins Museum, the DeYoung Museum, and most importantly for us here today, the Blanton Museum in Austin, Texas. So thank you, Professor, for all of your amazing work. I'd like to invite you both to come and join me on the stage. And while they do that, I'll just mention that the format for this afternoon's program will be more of a dialogue. We're gonna have a chat with all of you as part of the conversation. I'm gonna moderate, introducing a few questions addressed both to Elle and Professor Ogadichi, and we'll talk for about 45 minutes, kind of hash out some ideas that have to do with the show and with Elle's work and its legacy in terms of art history. And then the discussion will be followed by the all-important question and answer period. I know you have many questions for Professor Anatsui, and so we'll make sure that you have plenty of time for those as well. This exhibition is a retrospective of your work over the last 40 years, several decades, and it includes works in various media: wood, sculpture, or wood, metal, ceramics, other materials, painting. But some of the earliest pieces that we have in the exhibition are these wooden trays that were produced in Ghana, and I think, curatorially speaking, really set the stage for works to come. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how this idea came to be, how you worked with other people who sort of intervened, that these many hands that you like to talk about having a relationship to your work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I want to thank everybody here for finding time to come, well, to listen to the little that I have to say. Yeah, how did I start with the trays?
I have a couple up here.
When okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in art school, which I did at the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, in Ghana, it happened that the curriculum was skewered, you know, in towards Western art. Well, because the school was affiliated to Goldsmiths College, London, and most of the staff were from outside, with a sprinkling of indigenous staff who were also even trained abroad. You know, so there was very little exposure, or no exposure at all to whatever you could see and call indigenous art. You know, were taken through all the Western curriculum in art history and in the studios. And towards the end of the course, I and a couple of colleagues decided to really go out and find out something about, well, something that belongs to us, something that would teach us something about our own artistic heirloom. And incidentally, the college happened to be in Kumasi, where the National Cultural Center is located. And we used to go there over weekends to sit down and listen to music, watch artists painting, printing, fabric, weaving fabric, musicians, drumming, and all kinds of things. And over there, I discovered this body of signs that were peculiar and were very attractive to me because of the fact that they attempted to encapsulate some ideas which I thought were very abstract. You know, well, in art school, we were taught about the Renaissance and all these other, and that was a way of looking at the work which was more visual, you know, but coming across this body of work, I thought they were different, and they were approaching things from a different, looking at things from a different perspective. And so I got drawn to them, and for 5 years after I finished art school, I worked with them, trying to learn how to draw these and how to, well, follow the motions that created them, you know. Just like an art student in the US would have gone to museums, you know, to get acquainted with what happened in art before him or her. Yeah, I had my own museum material in these symbols, and in order to make things really indigenous, I looked for a ground which was also indigenous, and I incidentally came across these trays that are used by market women in displaying their wares. They will put tomatoes and fish and other things on them, round trays. And I thought that should be a beautiful way of really, well, a beautiful means of displaying these my symbols that I'm trying to work with. They actually printed on fabric, which are worn at funerals. And it's believed that funeral occasions are occasions for reflection upon life itself. So most of the symbols would have something to say about life, or, you know. And so I worked with this. On the fabric, they will be printed in so many repeats. Yeah, but what I did was to isolate them one by one, put one on a tray, and then create, normally in the middle of the tray, and then create an ambience on the border of the tray, which I thought would help to reinforce its meaning.
Well, that sort of ties in with this next image that I have, which is actually one of the title pieces for the exhibition. It's called When I Last Wrote to You About Africa. You often use very poetic titles, if not poetry, or references to language, communication, as we just saw with the trays using these Adinkra symbols in your work to communicate, but it's not often a very literal communication. It's more about this act of exchange between people. And so I wondered if maybe through this title piece you could continue to talk about that relationship between language and communication that runs through a lot of your work, and certainly through the exhibition.
Yeah, well, being that the source from which I got the symbols that inspired me were more like, to say, fabric or cloths which communicate. You know, the Adinkra cloth is a cloth which is saying something. And I think that has been something which has run through my work so far, you know, this idea of using text. You know, I came to Nigeria in 1975 after maybe some 5 years in Ghana, and upon arrival discovered that they also had many traditions of sign, communication, among the Igbo, among the Yoruba, among the Ibibio, and so on and so forth. And after that, I discovered that there are so many other such traditions in other parts of Africa, and at about that time in the university, I remember that I read somewhere claims that Africa did not have a writing tradition. And so coming across all this body of traditions which were aimed at communication, I thought that I should do a work which would say something about it. So this work, which happens to be the title work for the exhibition, took root from that time, and it consists of signs that I drew from all these traditions. The Uli is there, Nsibidi is there, Adinkra is there, and some other, plus some that I created myself, because after so many years of working with these, I thought I should be able to create my own signs as well. And all these are in that letter which I wrote about Africa.
L's work speaks in the language of poetry. This language, of course, is one that combines music with proverbs, so that each letter is layered in such a way that what the individual takes to the work becomes immensely amplified and rewarded just through the personal experience of the individual too. But one of the fascinating things that I see actually in L's work is the balance, or probably even the tension between the finished product and the creative process. And if you saw the process through which some of these incredibly beautiful pieces are created, you'll be amazed at the seeming contradiction. I saw one video once, I think it was made by the Smithsonian, in which you pressed this chainsaw into the body of the wood and lacerated it, and you were wearing this mask, and the entire room itself looked kind of darkish. And then as the chainsaw began to scream, it seems as if the wood itself is yelling back. And then, as if that violence wasn't enough, you grab a blowtorch and began to now burn into the body of this wood. But it's fascinating that as you did this, the work began to emerge into this incredibly beautiful object. So there's this almost tension between the creative process itself and the finished work. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, the processes that I use, especially when I work with wood, as you mentioned, were those of violence. Violence inflicted by a tool which was meant for violence. The chainsaw on wood is the height of violence, and not only that, the fire that I used. Now the chainsaw I kind of discovered or decided to use as an art tool. I've used it previously just to log wood, but I went to an artist colony long ago, I think 1980 or so, no, 1970, late 70s in Massachusetts, and there, I used chainsaw to log wood and brought it to my studio, and in trying to do some further work with it, I discovered that it has a language It has its own language, language which is characterized by the violence and roughness and dictatorial tendency, And so I decided to, when I went back, I decided to now explore it. And for about 14 to, well, I still work with it, but intensely I worked with it for about 14, 15 years, creating pieces that had so many allusions to so many things, including the history of Africa, more especially the conference that was held in Berlin in 18 something, in the late 1800s, at which the continent of Africa was put on a table and then shared. I thought that what I was doing with the chainsaw was trying to live those moments, of tearing, something into bits and pieces, So I worked with that for quite some time, before changing to the current media that I work with.
Well, I think the act of using the chainsaw brings us to this point where I wanted to talk about the element of chance in your work. It's a very difficult tool to control, even though I've seen you use it almost like a paintbrush or drawing, but it's jagged, it's rough, you never quite know what's going to happen. And as you say, things are often carved into pieces, or you carve pieces of things that eventually become a whole piece. And so I wanted to follow through on this and talk a little bit about the element of chance in your work. I have a picture of Digital River behind us where you used ceramic, but you often have pieces of things that come together and can be rearranged to be something new each and every time. Also, going back to thinking about the wood pieces, I have coins on Grandma's cloth up behind you where you use not only the chainsaw but a router and the wood slats. And so I think it'd be interesting to talk about how important this element of chance is in your work. And then we'll move to talking about the more recent bottle top pieces, which really take that element to a whole new level, I think.
Yeah, I think the element of chance has been something that has been lurking in my work right from when I was working with the chainsaw and other power tools. With the chainsaw, I would work in slats which would be put together into a composition. And I would originally put numbers behind, but that was only an initial proposition. The idea is that anybody who wants to display it has the freedom to ignore those numbers and use his own sequence, And these slats were so free that you could do so many things with them, apart from changing the order or rearranging them. You could do so many things by shifting them vertically and horizontally, and even playing with the intervals. You could separate them wider and then close them, and so many things were possible with them. And it began to appear to me that I was thinking about the artwork as something which is life itself. Life is not something which is cut and dried. It is something which is always in a state of flux. You don't know what each day is going to bring, and you don't know who is going to be your closest friend today or tomorrow. All these things keep changing. And I thought that my artwork should be something which reflects this fact.
And a perfect
You know,
example of this
and-
is the piece in the Blanton here. I thought you could also comment about how the bottle top pieces have this ability to change each and every time, and how that piece is installed here, and that ability to move as well, the element of chance in these works as well.
Yeah, with from the wood, I now came on to the metal pieces that had several elements linked together by wire, creating a form which is very free, and like fabric, that you can do anything, you can drape in any way. With the results that there is no time that any one of them would be displayed in 3 different places and then they will have the same format. They're capable of coming small, contracting small, and expanding, fully, and so many, and capable of being displayed in so many ways. They could be on the floor, they could be on walls, they could be on hedges, as I've done in some instances,
Speaking
and
of which,
so on
I have
and
some
so forth.
pictures of this piece being made in Nigeria, so people can see the mobility and movement of the piece. Do you remember this?
Oh yeah.
And you're talking about having it over a hedge. He was just mentioning the ability of it to move. But this is before it has any rumples and wrinkles on it, and yeah.
Well, I think it brings in the element of performance
Yes.
into the composition itself, and the performance starts not just with the finished work, but right from the moment of inspiration, when the artist begins to conceive the work itself, and it continues through the creative process, and doesn't stop until the work itself is consumed by the audience. But the concept of performance also enables even the audience to be part of this process. And it reminds me of some, anthropological methodology of participant observer, in which there isn't this separation between the maker and the viewer of the object. And I think it also brings in even the element of musicality, in the sense that if there is a musical piece written, it can be performed in different ways by different artists. If, for instance, this museum were to, God forbid, sell this object or loan it to some other museum, it could be totally arranged in a totally different way that would present it a very, very different kind of experience. And Elle is a musician. Do you want to tell the story of how you found out he's a musician?
Wow, you are putting me on the spot, but I'd love to. It's one of my favorite stories. So Al and I were hanging out in New York, and I found out it was his birthday. And this was when Fela was still on Broadway. It was several months ago, and I thought, I'm going to take him to see Fela. It'll be this great, Nigerian connection night. We'll have music, and he'll be excited. And I was very proud of myself. So we went to see it, and any of you who have seen Fela on Broadway, or as it's going through its tour, or have been to the Fela's Shrine in Nigeria, which I've had the great luck to do, it's all about movement and dance, and it's very much an experiential moment. So we're there, Elle and I clapping away, and after it was over, I said, Elle, wasn't that the greatest birthday present? I got to show you Fela. And he said, yeah, it's not as good as he was, in person. And I said, in person? And he said, yeah, well, my band used to open for him when he would tour in Africa. And I was so embarrassed, and that's when I first learned he was in a band called the Tech 10, which really fits along with what you're saying. There's sort of I hate to, quote jazz if that's not an influence of yours, but it does have a very jazz-like element to it, the ability to always move and sort of riff upon its location in any different environment and be experienced differently by each person that sees it. Is that, am I onto something here, or am I way off course?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I actually played trumpet in a university band in my school days, and well, we had our music director was an American, lecturer there, and he was taking us through jazz. We're playing tunes like Stomping at the Savoy and Take the A Train and, such stuff. And one day, band leader came and regaled us with music from a very talented young musician from Nigeria. And he happened to have stepped the music when he heard it on the radio and played it to us, and we thought, wow, this is something, and that happened to be Fela, starting off his career. He started with high life, but the high life was different from any high life you ever had. It had a jazz edge to it. And so we started following his career, and not too long after that introduction, Fela happened to come physically to Ghana on a tour, and he was brought to the university, and we had the opportunity of meeting him, and during his performance, our band was allowed to play during the recess, and and I played Fela's trumpet. He was a trumpeter before he switched on to.
I didn't know that part of the story.
Yeah.
It just gets bigger every time.
Before he before he switched on to saxophone, So he's a musician who is very, very close to my heart. And if I tell people that one of my reasons for having stayed in Nigeria all this while was that you had someone like Fela in Lagos, 6 hours away, that you could travel to and listen to. We followed his career, saw how his music changed in form first, and then later on, his lyrics became more, acquired more insight, and became more of a social, tool. So that's it about music and my.
When he talks about high life, I'm sure not everybody knows what high life is.
No.
High life is a West African musical form that is quite hybrid. It combines elements of R&B with calypso music from the Caribbean, with elements of reggae music, as well as West African drumming and rhythm. Even though it is found throughout West Africa, its home, its core actually is in Ghana, which is his homeland. And there are so many incredible high life musicians in Ghana. And one sees that element of musicality, of the improvisation of the high life musician in El's work.
I absolutely agree, and I think one of the things, now that we're talking about music, that I think connects, it is also a language, and it's also a way of communicating across cultures, and I find this to be a really important part of your work. I have a slide up here of opening market, which I think speaks very eloquently about the relationship between cultures and what we consume musically, visually, linguistically, and so I thought maybe this would be a good time to talk about how that's important to your work as well, the connections between people, between individuals, communities, global cultures, how important this is for you in ways that you work.
Yeah, not only connections between people, but the way people relate to objects, like the bottle caps, like this, and so many other things that I work with. It came a point in time that I got interested in things that people have put to use, things that people have employed in doing some other things, like these are empty tins that have been repurposed, into boxes, that, well, when I was a kid, we used, we used bigger versions of that kind of box, painted at the back in black and red, for traveling or while going to high school. You packed your things in it and went to school with it. So I was grandly surprised when, as an adult, I saw a miniature version of that, taking me so many years back to when I was a kid, and I was curious, to know what those boxes were still being used for. And I was told that they were trinket boxes, and being trinket boxes, they're small in size. And when I opened, I saw that the one I opened was the empty tin of Ovaltine, and I looked for the thinkers who produce these things and discovered that they use almost anything, all the produces that are you can find in the market, and I decided to commission them to produce these boxes for me. And when they produced them, I saw the various products that are displayed in them. That's the market. And then at the back of them, they painted them black and red. And I think this should have something of Islamic origin, because the red is a crescent, the crescent moon. Yeah, but I don't know where it came from when we used this as kids, and up till today I don't know, but I should think that it should have Islamic origins. Now, the title came about when I went to Nsukka market to look for more produce, because I needed more, and I saw a flask made in, I think, Japan for the UK in Nsukka market, and so many other products. And it began to occur to me that this is something like an open market. A good made for the European Union is being sold there, and so on and so forth. So the idea of open market or opening market came in. An open market can refer to so many things, because Africa is a place that has received things from so many parts of the world, not only goods, but ideologies and even education and all those things. They came from all parts of the world. So it's, to me, an open market.
Well, I think that's interesting. You're talking about different markets and relationships with other cultures that you find in Nsukka, but you have traveled quite far and wide yourself and experienced other cultures in many different ways, and especially for artists in residency programs. I think that's a big part of your work as well that has influenced a number of projects. And so we can talk a little bit about Akua's Surviving Children or some of the other projects you've done on different residencies, and how you also work with objects you find in the environment when you're traveling on these residency programs.
Okay, Aqua Surviving Children is it's in the show, and
yes, it's in the show.
It's made from driftwood, that I collected on the beach in Denmark. Is it Denmark? Yeah, Denmark. And this is the story behind it. I was invited by the Danish government to come and do a work in response to I think they were celebrating 200 years of abolition of slavery, and they happened to have done their slavery project in the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana, where I come from. And so they looked for a Ghanaian artist, and I was invited. I was taken there and given a blank sheet to just create anything. And they took me to so many places that they thought it would be okay or ideal for me to work. And they didn't quite strike any chord in me until finally somebody asked, have you taken him to the hammer mill? So following the way, I was taken to the hammer mill, which happens to be a forge that was used in making nozzles for guns, you know. And anybody my age in West Africa will know about Den guns. Yeah, Den guns. So the idea came, so this is where Den guns were made, which were used in slave raids in Africa. So I said, I'm going to work here in the forge. I didn't have any idea about blacksmithing or any such thing, but I knew that there would be some elements that I could use in the forge, you know, to create something. And the forge happened to be very close to the sea. That evening when I was going home, I was standing by the shore for the train to come, and I saw down by the coast a log. So I went down, erased it, and saw how the elements of nature have worked on these, because these three that have been tossed into the sea, that have been used maybe as mooring or something. It has something to do with the sea. So it's been exposed to all the elements, water, air, what have you, you know, and finally it's been washed ashore. And I thought that was a good metaphor for, you know, the idea of tearing people from land and taking them to a strange environment, and finally they are coming back to land, you know. And the intervention that I did on them in the forge was to use the fire of the forge to burn little pieces that I attached to the standing ones, you know, so they became something like humanoid forms. And the idea of the fire was to, well, if this have been exposed to the elements of water and air, I thought fire was the last one that they needed in order to complete a cycle. You know, so their faces are burnt black in order to, you know, integrate them into society. So that's how Aqua's surviving children came about. And the name Aqua's child, Aquaba, if anybody knows about Aquaba, the Aquaba doll, that's a fertility doll, which, well, is common in Akan, part of Ghana. And I'm sure some people would have known about it. The Aquaba doll, which has a round head, and then the arms are this way, and then a slim torso. Yeah, I was thinking, if the fertility doll is called Aqua's child, then I was thinking about a womb that is so fertile as to produce so many children that after so many have been taken away, there is still some more left.
I was just thinking about how El's work has really changed the visual language of contemporary African art in many ways, because one of the major paradigms for working in contemporary African art is to look from elements of traditional African art and combine that with the contemporary. But with L's intervention, this seems to have changed. A lot of the artists that are now growing up are not so much interested in these synthesis of the past and the present. They now seem to be more interested in exploring environmentally conscious art, that is looking for found objects and using the found objects in new arrangements. And I wonder how you want to react to the works of these artists who are now influenced by your work.
Yeah, I've always believed in the element of change. You know, I don't think that things should, well, like my works, you know, they shouldn't be the same thing. Anytime you see them, they should be changing. You know, and as a teacher, I've always given my students things which contain challenges. If a project doesn't have any challenge, then I wouldn't give it to them, you know. And I thought that one of the best challenges that you can give to students is to have them face a new medium, a medium that they are not used to. Because when you are used to a medium, the tendency will be that as soon as you see it, you start doing the usual thing with it. But if the medium is new, then it will stop you in your tracks, and you have to sit down and think and work out what precisely to do with it. And in the process, you are developing a language, you know. Now, it is not that the use of found objects, objects from the environment, is new to African, art produced in the African continent. You know, I think it's something that has been there right from the beginning. We've only had an interregnum of we only had the incidence of art schools coming in from the West, you know, interrupting this and instituting in its place the use of the so-called traditional materials. Like when I was in art school, we were handling plaster of Paris and such stuff which didn't have any relationship, you know, to the environment. It wasn't produced there, and so on and so forth. And I thought that in traditional African art, which you got to know about later on, they would use things that were occurring in the environment. You know, they will combine things like wood and skin and so on and so forth, feathers, and, you know, in other words, they source their material or their media right from around them, you know. And we've had a long period of art schools having introduced this idea, which took us rather back. And so what I think I'm trying to do, me and some colleagues are trying to do, is to kind of bring back this kind of attitude that in the past would lead artists to work with these unusual materials. You know, so yeah, I think the students of mine who are working in that line are doing great work, and I can see the future for them kind of helping to enrich our lives.
I think that's one of the great legacies that you have given to the students in Nigeria, but throughout the world. I've had the great pleasure to know some of your students and how they've taken this lesson that you've given them and applied it to their work. People often ask me if their work looks like yours. And I say, well, it's not that it looks like it, but they've really taken what the master has taught them in terms of looking around and using things in your environment. That might be bottle caps, or it might be pieces of wood. But to take them, and I remember you said to Bright, it was, that if you have something as simple as a piece of wood, bring them together en masse. Make it big. Make it so that when someone stands in front of it, they are dizzy. And I thought that was such a lesson, that's such an instruction for the students to learn how to take a couple of bottle caps, and then there's a couple hundred bottle caps, then there's thousands of bottle caps. And then it's this monument to the life around you. I remember the piece we built with just logs that we piled high and you painted the ends of them. So taking something very simple and giving it this stature, I think, is really one of the great legacies of your teaching. And I do look forward to seeing some exhibitions of work by Nana Akori and Bright Ike, and some of your students have really listened to the master. And I know that's important on a teaching campus, to really listen to what your professors are telling you and take that and make it something that's yours, and take it out into the world in a new way, which fits in with your idea of change as well. Take it and make it your own and make it new.
Yeah, and I was very happy when a student of mine came for his graduate work, and I asked him what he wants to, and he said he wants to work with water. It's a sculpture. I said, okay. and I think today he is one of the best known of my students. He's got invitations to almost every place, that has something to do with the environment, Yeah, because he set himself that task of going into a medium which is unusual and which has challenges, yeah.
Well, on that note, should we be students ourselves of Professor Anatsui and ask him some questions? Is this a good time to do that? All right.
I happened to grow up at a time that my country I was about teenage when my country became independent. And the idea of independence was brought in this sense of euphoria, and we thought we were free, and therefore we are going to do something great, And one of the first things that we did was, colonialism covered your face with some veil, and now the veil is removed. What do? You look around and see. So in most parts of Africa at the time, there were movements, maybe syndromes of going back to look at some of the things that were there before the colonial project started, and trying to learn things from the past. In Ghana, I remember we had a Sankofa syndrome. Sankofa means go back and pick. Go back and pick. It's a sense of, something like introducing the sense of historicity, into one's life. You don't just keep moving forward, but you go back and look at what you did in the past and try to use it as a way of moving forward. And when I came to Nigeria too, they had I think you know about the Rosarial rebels. There were people who rebelled against the Western way of teaching art, and opened up, vistas to people to look more at indigenous art forms. And one of the very common ones is the uli, which happens to be championed by Uche Okeke, who happened to be the chair of the school that I went to when I went to Nigeria. So me coming from the Sankofa and then he coming from the Uli, schools, found it easy to move along. Yeah, I have this habit of naming some works long after they've been. Yeah, because most of the time you don't understand what you've done, and it takes some time. The intervention of time, might bring to you some probably understanding of. Yeah, when I did that work, incidentally it's a two-sided piece. The back says something else, and the front says something.
It's the back, yeah?
It is the back, part of the back, yeah.
And there's the front.
And that's the front. And I saw that, looking at it, I have a feeling that what is happening is seepage. There is a seepage happening there. So only 2 days ago, I gave it the title Seepage. So it's no longer untitled.
Which I think it's a part of your process. As you said, you often give a title later on, and that for me also has to do with this element of chance and play, and you never quite know what's going to happen.
Would you be open to the display of the back itself?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I did tell when we went to the museum, I reminded you that it had, so you could occasionally show the back, and people would think you bought a new work. No, they're not always in English. There have been several works that I titled in my language, because my language is a very peculiar one. It is tonal, like most African languages are tonal. The same word, different inflections could mean so many different things. You can have a word, same spelling. If you don't tone mark it, can mean, but when you tone mark it, then it means a particular thing. And in my language, we don't tone mark it. I know that in Yoruba you tone mark, and Igbos have plenty of tone marks, So theirs is more precise than my language. My language, you just leave it open. So, so that element of the indeterminate makes it attractive to me to use it for titling, for titles, so that it could mean so many things.
A good example would be, say, Agban in my language. Agban would be wasp, Agban would be chin, Agban would be coconut, Agban would be basket, and so on and so forth. Just.
This is why I don't speak Yoruba. My Cleveland tongue can't do it.
Yeah, with this process, when I work with chainsaw, machines are fast and you have to think about what you want to do before you start them. But with this, which is manual and laborious and slow, I don't do any drawings any longer. I start with a portion and then keep growing. Because it's something spread over many, many days or months. So it's an organic kind of thing. Yes, I have many people many people who assist me. Where I work, there are a lot of young chaps who are just out of high school. And in Nigeria, university places are very limited, and there's this big competition for them. You got to, take exams, entrance exams, and do well to get in there. And most high school leavers would spend 2-3 years taking this exam before they finally make it. And so these young chaps living in the vicinity of my studio come in to help me, whilst preparing for this exam. And on a good day, I could have like 30 people all working, And with that, what would have taken maybe years, this probably with me alone, you'll be talking about a year or more, but with this, then you divide it by 30. They are directed. I could come in and say, okay, now let's have this in black. Let's use black throughout. Maybe I think this work started from the middle, the black portion there. And after some period of going with the black, said, okay, let's mix it with something. So it tones out into a lighter color. And finally, say, okay, let's use the silver. The silver is the back of the bottle cap, the inside of the bottle cap. The outside would have the colors, but the inside is silver. So I have the freedom to use all those colors. So that's how it grows. I've had the occasion of having this displayed. In Venice, the work was outside. Venice is a lot of salt and wind, and was outside for 6 months. And when it came back, I saw that the sun, the salt, and everything had affected it. And to me, that was a very beautiful discovery, because the colors that were reduced, were very, very appealing. The patina of age. Yeah, it came with them. So I now use that. I now spread some of the bottle caps in the sun so that they can get bleached, and given that old look. Yeah. The same applies to tearing and all those things. Tears, okay, they are welcome. You can patch them anyway if you want, but love to me, I wouldn't patch them. When you have, even as a human being, you have to age and things have to change or become dysfunctional about you, and so on and so forth, and you have to learn to live with them. Yeah, this is some of the fights that I've had with museum people. They want things to stay that way throughout, And I say, no, leave the things to grow old.
It was indeed given during this visit to Austin, and it's seepage, as if there was, this is probably not the most beautiful analogy, but I was thinking of some sort of like oil or some sort of dark liquid that you set a cloth on, and it starts to seep through and makes a beautiful pattern. That's kind of the visual I'm getting from this. Is that the right connection? So yeah. Seepage.
Yeah, the first 2 pieces of these I made. I titled them Man's Cloth and Woman's Cloth. That's taking the idea from the Kente tradition. But then, if you go beyond that, you'll see that the work which are addressing, gender issues, and they're not limited to the idea of kente. Yeah, I'm from a kente weaving tradition, but that wasn't what I've been working with. It's by coincidence that the color schemes of the bottle caps, which I didn't give to the caps anyway, that's how I found them. The color schemes happen to be those of kente cloth. So my work is not limited. It has allusions to kente, but it's not limited to kente. If you try to look beyond kente, then you might be able to get something more out of.
I would actually say that when we were acquiring his work at the Denver Art Museum, one of the ways through which I presented the work to the board members, who basically had a Western education, was to highlight ideas of abstract expressionism, of color-filled painting, of even pop art as part of the language from which he's drawing, in addition, of course, to indigenous African art.
I think, and the work, starting from the idea, you tend to close yourself in, and you wouldn't look anywhere else. You want to focus on it, and it becomes a problem, limits you. And maybe if you spend many years, you could get it, but you don't have many years to live. Yeah, that's what I find out. Yeah, okay. So I work straight with the material or the process. Yeah. What I can say to that is this: that I know about the collective unconscious. My people, the FS. In their migration history, passed through Yoruba land. The Ketu and all these places resonate in the history of my people, and I think that the collective unconscious might be at work over here in this case. It's not something that I personally experienced but my people have experienced it, and therefore it's part of my consciousness, and so I think that it's likely that such influences are there.
Good. I think that's a great place to end on the influence of Africa and Elle's work in our lives. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Elle.